Okay, so Nova Scribes, we are excited to have Lisa Arora here to speak with you about visuals for mediation and resolving disputes. A little bit about Lisa. She is an expert visual facilitator who works with executive teams and boards all over the globe to mine their diverse perspectives, align on a desired future, and focus on strategic action. Her interactive visual methods boost listening, maximize participation, and end the dysfunction so often found in collaborative decision making. In 2013, Lisa's world was rocked when mediation proved unsuccessful twice during her own divorce. With Lisa's background, the absence of visual communication in mediations she experienced was stark obvious. She could imagine a much better process where she and her ex could have felt more confident in the process and avoided a ton of confusion and painfully problematic communication. That's when she developed a passion for combining visual communication with mediation and returned to the Justice Institute of British Columbia to become a certified family mediator. In addition to visual facilitation, Lisa now runs a private divorce mediation practice in Victoria, British Columbia, and teaches impartials such as mediators, ombuds, and other dispute resolution practitioners to harness the power of visual communication in dispute resolution. During this session, you're going to see some of the tools and approaches that Lisa uses. You'll have the chance to participate in some of the activities and contribute your ideas and questions. So please be prepared to interact. With that, Lisa, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. And I want to start by giving you my kudos for creating this Nova Scribes community and also to recognize the people in this community. I was so impressed to see the number of registrations, which to me indicate interest in not just visuals, but also how they apply to dispute resolution. And that is something I'm keen to talk to anyone about who is keen to talk to me about it. And so a little bit about myself. I'm calling in today from the traditional unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking people, otherwise known as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations, otherwise known as Victoria, BC, and Canada. And by way of introducing myself, I thought I might share with you a childhood photo that I recently dug up. Call it a self-deprecating childhood photo. Are you able to see that photo? That's me. I believe I'm around age 5 there. And clearly I'm in love with my biceps. I don't know what it says about my personality, but I do think, when you look back at your childhood photos, you can see yourself reflected in your earliest versions. But why that photo is significant is not only was body paint in the 70s, that was the time when my parents divorced, and it was the early 70s. And divorce was just kind of a brand new thing. And there wasn't sophisticated law around divorce. And I remember at that time, I only knew one other family in my entire school who had a divorce in their family. And they were almost like celebrities because it really wasn't a thing. And my parents turned out to be, like have a very complicated War of the Roses divorce. It was vicious, it was terrible, it was violent, it dragged on in the court system for 7 years. And I watched all that as a child. They were themselves about age 30, succeeding financially, had just built their dream house. And by the time they finished this long drawn out court battle, neither one of them had a penny left. And as a result, I was raised in poverty by a single mom and had really internalized for myself that I did not want to repeat my parents' divorce. And fast forward, I'm in my 30s and I decide I'm going to start a small business in the field of visual facilitation. And I had always been in the field of facilitation and education, but I had recently learned about the power of visuals and had set upon the path of learning to work visually. and decided that I was going to quit my job and start my own consulting practice. And around the same time, I was getting married. And my husband was supportive of my business in the beginning when it was small and fledgling. Over the years, my business grew and grew, and it took me further afield. I was traveling a lot for work. I had a baby at home, and I came home from a work trip, and my husband said, "You're not the wife I thought I was getting. I want a divorce." So I found myself in the exact shoes I vowed that I would never be in. And I think it's a bit like what they say, you know, when you're riding a bike, you go where your eyes are looking. And I think, you know, in my life, I was focusing on not replicating my parents' divorce. And that's exactly where I went, because that's what I was focused on. So all of that to say that my divorce process was an unpleasant one, much the same as my parents' was. But what was different for me is that I had what's called alternative dispute resolution processes available to me, which meant that in my time of divorce, court is not the first and automatic option. And through the process of divorcing, we did attempt mediation twice in the course of a year. And I'm sorry to say that both times those mediations failed. And I will tell you that as a visual facilitator who understands process, not only did I go through those experiences and look at them and say, these could be way better, like just from a pure process point of view, to be sort of more client-centered. As well, I struggled as a participant because I am a visual thinker and nothing was visual. And in both failed mediations, the reason they failed could be traced back to the fact that what was being talked about was not being written down in real time. So to give you an example, in the second mediation, we had been in mediation for almost 8 straight hours and nothing had moved, right? Which a good mediator would not allow. And we were in a shuttle format, which means the mediator felt the conflict was too hot and we should be in separate rooms. And so she went back and forth communicating across those 2 rooms. After 8 hours, effectively, we were in the same place as the first proposal that had been put on the table at the very start of the divorce. So I said, you know what, I'm exhausted, I give up. I don't care, I will just sign off on this. Except for there's this one clause about the vehicles. Take this back to the other room and propose this. So she went back, talked to them, came back, talked to me. We thought we had agreement. We left the mediation, and she documented things the next day and sent it to me. And when I read it, I said, that's not how I remember it. And she said, oh, okay, well, I'll take it back to him and see how he remembers it. And she took it back to him, and he had a second understanding of what we had agreed on. And she came back to me and she said, you know, it's so bizarre. The way I understood it wasn't either of those ways. And so I was absolutely gobsmacked by how 3 people could be in the same conversation and take away 3 different understandings of what they thought in good faith had been agreed to. And that's what really got the fire in my belly going about inspiring dispute resolution practitioners to work visually in their practices, because I really do believe it is a more client-centric approach. And so that's a little bit about me. As Brian said, now today I work both as a visual facilitator and a visual mediator. I do know there is great thirst out there in the dispute resolution community to learn how to work this way. In the last, or the 2 years prior to pandemic when travel stopped, I had spoken at 17 dispute resolution conferences over 24 months. So I know people want to talk about this stuff. And I thought it would be good if we just start off and find out who is in this group today, and what are the things that you focus on in your practice. And so I've asked Brian to set up a poll, which he will make live. There it is. So, the question is, who's in our group today? Not how much experience do you have with augmented reality?
That was, forget about that one. Hang on.
However, that adds a whole nother dimension to the conversation.
Forget about that first line.
We'll call that a mashup. So I'd like you to reflect as best you can with the responses here, what characterizes your practice. So mediation is my primary focus, or I'm some other type of dispute resolution practitioner, or I'm neither of those, I'm a facilitator. But sometimes I find myself in situations where I run into people who are in conflict, or none of the above describes me. So go ahead and respond to the poll.
I think we've got it. That's about, yep, looks like everybody's going to weigh in has weighed in.
Okay. All right. Yeah, this is what I suspected. So we have a few mediators in the pile and mostly facilitators here. And I'd be curious to hear, if you were a none of the above, what it is you're up to in your practice. Just so I can better understand that miscellaneous category.
I'm just a curious sketchnoter.
Ah, okay, fabulous.
Looking to learn new skills.
Yeah, great.
I saw that Shanice had her hand up.
Yeah, hi. I'm actually a student. I'm looking to do my mediation, my family mediation license. Right now, I'm just finishing up my bachelor.
Great, thank you.
I'm a nonprofit chief of staff, and I dabble in mediation. I'm sorry, in facilitation, mostly from watching and learning from Brian. And there's a lot of conflict resolution in my role, but it's not necessarily part of my job description. It's not necessarily.
Okay. Thank you. Well, that gives me a bit of a flavor. You know, from my story, as you know, I had visual facilitation skills first, and then I learned mediation process. And I think in many ways, having visual facilitation skills first made it easier to learn mediation. And so I would say, if you are a facilitator who is dispute resolution curious, especially if you know how to work visually, go get some formal training in mediation process, because with your skill sets combined, you have a very innovative, unique offering in the marketplace. And I can tell you, there are no shortage of disputes out there to be resolved. And I would distinguish between conflict and disputes. I asked you in the poll, you know, if you're a facilitator and you're out there working with groups, do you ever bump into conflict? Well, conflict and disputes are two very different things. Conflicts typically occur at the values level, the beliefs level, and some dispute resolution experts argue that conflicts should not and cannot be resolved. Disputes, on the other hand, are problems that can be framed in solvable ways, such as what will the parenting schedule look like? You know, in a neighbor dispute, who will do what in order to establish the new fence repair? That kind of solvable, tangible thing. And so I would say, if you're coming at it from the other way around, if you're one of the few mediators who are in this group, or you maybe like Gina are already working visually and you're just more curious to integrate visuals fully into your practice, I'm here to say that learning to work visually is totally learnable. And I am committed to the idea that if you are a part of delivering alternative dispute resolution, the alternative part of that has meant alternative to the court system. And there's a high demand for those services, because if you've ever been to court, you know how much it sucks. And people want a better process. They want a process where they can take a more collaborative approach, where they can be the decision maker, where they have some choices in the outcome versus someone like a judge telling them how their future life is going to go. And so while alternative dispute resolution has popularized and there's great demand for those services, I would argue that the field has to go further in terms of becoming client-centric and innovative. It should be looking to distance itself as far as possible from what it feels like to experience a legal process. Brian.
Yeah, I just noticed a couple of people in chat asked, where might you go to learn that certification or get that learning?
This is a great question. And I'm glad you're asking it because it means you're curious to go and build these skills. I can speak to sort of the locale where I live. I was trained through the Justice Institute of British Columbia. And it's about a 2-year program that has practical components. Like you actually have go before a panel and conduct a mediation and receive critique and so on. And I would say that US included and speaking globally, it's a dog's breakfast out there with regards to mediation training. You can find 2-hour mediation courses that theoretically you could take and hang out your shingle and say, I'm a mediator. Or you could find master's programs in dispute resolution, and it really varies. There is no sort of global agreement around what amount or quality of training equals a professional mediator. For me in BC, where I live, when it comes to family mediation in particular, it's actually regulated. So I have to be certified by a provincial regulator, as well as I'm certified by a national regulator in order to practice family mediation. On the other hand, I could mediate any other type of dispute without those credentials. I could do it with no training at all because it's not regulated. So it will vary, the training offerings available, the regulation situation, it will vary depending on where it is that you live and work. And I would say, if you're curious, go find a 2-day mediation course. And if you like it, keep going, find something more substantial. Okay, I have to say that today's session, I really prepared to speak my manifesto to mediators and dispute resolution practitioners. And I recognize that a lot of the people in this group are not that person. And so I just want to say that some of the things that I will put out here today is not going to be new news to you. You know, all of you visual facilitators on this call, you are visual facilitators because you know facilitation is a process and you know it's better when it's visual. And really, what I'm suggesting here is no different. Mediation is a distinct process, and I would argue that it is better when it's visual. So I will just take a moment and bring up some slides here. All right, are you able to see those? One second here.
We can see them, Lisa.
You still can. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I had a game plan in mind for us today. We have about an hour and a half. And I wanted to share with you how I think working visually creates what I would call a super culture of collaboration, as well as the top 5 beliefs that I think get in the way of dispute resolution practitioners from actually working visually, even though they might nod their head and say, yeah, that's a great idea. It should be more like that. There is a number of things that are often in the way for people to pick up their marker and actually start working that way. And so I'll share those with you, and then we can pause. I'll take your questions. We can talk about anything that's top of mind for you. And you may have more specific questions about what my mediation practice looks like and how I actually layer in visuals, and we can get into that. As well as I'm curious for you to chime in at any point what you have learned works in situations where there's tension in the room, disputes, etc. How does that sound? Great, I see some thumbs up. So a few suggestions I would make is just keep an open mind and be prepared to learn from everybody on the call. Try and think this through from two perspectives. One is your own perspective as being the person in the chair who is courageously stepping up to assist people who are trying to resolve a dispute. And the other perspective as being the person who is embroiled in the dispute. And I say embroiled because there is an emotional difference in a mediation versus a facilitation. And that really impacts how I use visuals in that process. So as I mentioned, you know, as a visual mediator now, I have been able to take my visual facilitation skills and apply them to mediation process to help people through their disputes. And I do that in a number of ways. And much of it is no different from how I would layer visuals into a facilitation. So you can see up here on the screen, I will use information graphics to explain process information to people. Typically what people get when they enter a mediation is probably like a 12-page linear text-based document that says everything that this picture up here says. And so I'm able to give them both. They can kind of digest the big picture, and then if they're really needing to know the details, they can go into that more traditional style document. I also have, and I think, Brian, this goes back to something you said to me when we were preparing for this session. You said, oh my God, I can't wait to come and see the tricks you have, like the stuff you use, the silver bullets. What are those tools you use that just like make it happen? And I didn't want to disappoint you then, but there aren't any. Most mediators will have built a whole bag of tricks, and they will pull them in and use them in scenarios where it makes sense. And so you and I, Brian, had talked about that grid with the axis of relationship versus result, and having a conversation with the parties about what, you know, where is the way they're approaching things now situated on that grid versus where would they like it to be, and so on. This next one here is Bill Eddy's errors in thinking. He's a very prominent dispute resolution expert. And this is a tool that sometimes when I'm meeting with people and I can hear their errors in their thinking, I will give them this visual that's already created ahead of time, and I will give it to them for homework. And I'll say, go take yourself for a cup of tea and reflect on yourself. Brian.
We had a request in chat. Is it possible to view one of these pages at a time, just so that it's a little bit more landscape format? It's a little difficult to see the two. Thank you.
Let's see, does that help?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay, great. And so using visuals to encourage self-reflection is another application. I often use templates, for example, in co-creating an agenda or setting the foundation for a mediation. And then just like in visual facilitation, sometimes I start with a blank page and I use that paper to capture the important pieces of real-time problem solving with people. And so I want to just kind of stop for a second and build on what we started chatting about earlier around how mediation is different from facilitation. So for the mediators we have on the call, where would you start differentiating mediation from facilitation? Go ahead and chime in.
So I do both mediation and facilitation. And when I'm mediating, there are two people who have been arguing.
Mm.
And when I facilitate, there may be a lot of different ideas. There may or may not be conflict, but there usually isn't, at least in the experiences I've had, two people who have really gone head to head over something that's important to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they're the emotional, the emotions that are in the room when people are embroiled in conflict is one thing that differentiates it. We also talked about how, depending on where you're practicing mediation, you may be required to actually have some training and regulation, which is not the same of facilitation. In many mediated situations, mediators need knowledge of the legal context that surrounds the dispute that is happening. And so that's another differentiator from facilitation. As well as when people enter the mediation process, they actually sign a contract, which is an agreement to participate. And in there, they agree to certain aspects of how mediation works. One of those being confidentiality, and that being a really, really important aspect of the agreement for how people respect the process that they're entering into. And I would say that a lot of mediators, much like facilitators have their bags of tricks too. Mediators, there are different types of mediation and different models out there, and many mediators blend those models. So the model that I'm trained in and use is an interest-based model, where I'm listening for underlying interests and positions. And so I'm listening for certain layers of the conversation, and it follows 4 stages through the process. But I think one of the biggest differentiators is that in mediation, it's my job to show up as an impartial, which means that I stay neutral. It doesn't mean that I don't have opinions about what's going on, but it means that I don't tell people what decisions I think that they should make. I don't take sides, and I advocate for a fair discussion where everybody has the chance to exchange information. The people in the process are self-determined decision makers. This is why they prefer it to going to court, because they are the decision makers. Ultimately, the people in the room get to say what they agree to. And so with that, it's a little bit different from facilitation, because the outcome, the success of the process, it rests with the parties. That's very different from facilitation, when I get hired to go in and create a strategic plan with a board. The success of getting that strategic plan done rests with me as the facilitator. In mediation, the outcome rests with the parties who are there. And as I said earlier, mediators often have a set of tricks or specialized communication skills. They know how to reframe things. They know how to listen for positions and interests and all that kind of thing. So there are some differences between mediation and facilitation that are not insignificant. And those differences really do impact how I do and do not use visuals in the process. And we can say more about that. I'm curious for you to have a chance to say, you can probably think of a time where you've been in a spat with someone, or you've had the opportunity to watch a team or a couple or siblings or anyone in dispute. And so I want you to conjure up a dispute that you've seen and just chime in. What do you notice gets in the way of communication for people when they're in a dispute situation?
Listening.
How come?
a lot of people talking and not very many people listening to what the other people are saying.
Yeah, sometimes people want to talk over top of each other, right? And do you know why that happens?
We'll see people who have different agendas, so they want to make sure that their agenda, or that they're pushing the outcome that they want out of it, and not considering other potential outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're not really interested in hearing any of the arguments that might support that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So they might not be there in good faith. And by that, I mean in good faith to actually invest in understanding what someone else wants. Secondly, I think what's also embedded in there is that when people are putting forth what they want or their agenda, their biggest underlying fear is that they're not going to be heard by the other person. And so you oftentimes have people talking over top of each other because they fear they're not being heard. And if there's one sure way to not be heard, it's for everyone to try and talk at once. What else gets in the way?
Lisa, I don't know if you're noticing, there's some great ideas that are coming in on chat.
Okay, I'll have a look here. Yeah, it could be feelings. It could be I'm sitting across the table and you have cheated on me and I just hate your guts right now. Primal responses, they may lack information. Yes. Yes. So all of these things, lack of trust, absolutely. And so I think this is one of the things I internalized when I was in my own divorce process, is that when people are in a dispute situation, or when you're sitting across from your ex who you feel in some way has let you down, it's intensely emotional and you're under stress, right? There's a lot at stake when you're organizing who's going to be the parent, who gets what, how do you divide debt, all of those things. It's very stressful. And what's true is the amygdala in the brain gets activated and it shuts down our ability to think and hear and articulate ourselves the way that we normally can. So this is a real thing. And I remember it in my own divorce mediation. I remember driving home and being like, oh my God, I wanted to say that. How could I have forgotten to say that, right? Well, the reason is because your brain is offline to a large degree when you're under stress. And so again, the obvious argument is that why do we do everything verbally, especially in these high stakes situations? Why wouldn't you add a second channel of communication that's going to restore some people's ability to take in information? And I would argue that one of the beliefs that keeps people stuck, even alternative dispute resolution practitioners, keeps them stuck working only in linear-based text documents and working only verbally, is we all hold this assumption. There's a guy, George Bernard Shaw, he's an Irish playwright and a political activist. And he says, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. So all of us, to some degree in our lives, we live in this delusion that if we've emailed something to our clients, that they've read it, that they've understood it. And that may or may not be true. Or we think that if we've explained something verbally to people, that they got it. Or that if we've had a conversation with someone, that we're both taking away the same meaning. And this belief that if it was read, spoken, that communication has occurred, I think gets us into trouble. And, you know, the story I told you earlier about the 3 understandings in my own divorce mediation is sort of case in point. And, you know, that's when I realized that if that mediator had have even been writing down on her own clipboard that went back and forth between the rooms, the meaning she was making, he and I would have realized her meaning didn't match ours, right? We literally have had the feedback to know if we were on the same page. So I think the shift that people need to make is that as someone working in a dispute, the responsibility really is on you to test if communication has occurred. Just saying it is not enough. And when you work visually, you make your understanding as the mediator transparent to people. And it gives people the opportunity to confirm that the words you're putting on the paper are what they took away too, or to clarify. And I think that's really the power of public notes. How good of a communicator do you all think you are? Where would you put yourself? Answer that for yourself. And then if you're someone who's saying, I think I'm pretty great, possibly even elite, maybe pretty good, go ahead and throw in the chat box. What are the things that make you a good communicator? What are those things exactly? I'm pretty good-ish. Restating things, repeating things, paraphrasing things. What else makes you a good clarifying things, asking good clarifying questions, being open-minded, listening well, checking your assumptions? Yep. All of those things make up strong communicators, people who can explain things in plain words and organize their thoughts well. And what nobody has said in here, even in this community of visual practitioners, is that what puts you in this upper range is also visual communication, whether or not you can use visual language. Most of us, all the things we said in there, relies on verbal communication and our ears. And none of us said visual communication. And so I would argue that to move from pretty great to elite, you need to learn to speak the language of visuals. And I think the belief that keeps us stuck there is that how we're doing it now, this verbal, Word document way, is good enough. And we know that it goes against the way humans are actually wired. We know that most of the information that goes to our brains is visual, and that 65% of the people who come to mediate with me, they are visual learners just like me, and that they can process information 60,000 times faster than text. I just find that so incredibly staggering. So, if you're only working verbally with people, you are leaving so much off the table. Let me show you an example here. Experience it yourself. I worked a couple years ago with the International Ombuds Association. And one of the things they kept saying to me is, nobody ever understands what an ombuds is. It takes us so long to explain to people what an ombuds is. And I said, well, how are you explaining it? Like, how do you do this? Well, we have a page on our website. And so that's what I'm going to show you. I want to do an experiment with you. I'm going to give you 5 seconds on each page of their website. And your job is to grasp as much as you can. Okay, ready? Here's page 1. And here's page 2. I see some laughter. So I can show it to you like that, or I can show it to you like this. I'll give you 5 seconds here. And now let me ask you, how was the experience of taking in that information different? Go ahead and chime in.
Night and day.
How so?
Well, first of all, I couldn't read. It was so tiny and, confusing at a point. I tried to put myself on the shoes that somebody that really needs this information, and it was chaotic to me.
Yeah. When you see all of that dense text, you immediately want to give up. I saw some of you smile when you saw page 2. You were like, yeah, there's not a chance I'm going to engage with this, right? Yeah. Any other comments about how it's different?
What
It's
stood out
grouped
to me
into-
was
sorry.
oh no, I'm so I apologize. What stood out to me is like, so the first half kind of seemed like my regular lecture notes, and then the second one just the colors, and it seems more interactive. I'm a visual learner, but I'm also, like, for example, during lectures I have to write down everything. I can't type everything down, but having the colors and it being broken down and summarized very well was more appealing.
Mm-hmm. And if you only took one thing away from this visual, even if you never read any of the text on it and you just looked at the main image there, what would you understand an ombuds does?
Well, I would have added that it tells a story. This last image, for the first time, I can see clearly that there is something happens over a passage of time that the ombudsman or the ombuds does. That takes an issue from where it is and makes it become resolved.
Exactly.
So it's storytelling.
Exactly. And so if that's all you took away from this map, you'd have it. You'd have the nugget of what an ombuds does, right? They actually sit down, they care about your issue, and they help you get it fixed over time. And so interesting that you could grasp that in a few seconds as opposed to reading all that other text. And moreover, it's not that people can just process that information faster, they'll also retain it so much better. And, you know, I think this is important when you start to apply it to high stakes situations where people are resolving disputes about their kids and making agreements about their futures. Remembering and retaining is really, really key. So again, I think it's on dispute resolution practitioners to really say that they have to become elite level communicators, and visual communication is a part of that. Another thing that keeps people stuck is that they think people aren't going to take them serious. You know, I've had people say to me, okay, I get it. This is a more client-centric way to work, but you don't understand. I work with judges, I work with lawyers. Nobody is going to take me seriously if I show up and start, you know, sketching stuff on the wall. And to that, I would say it's just not true. The very first visual mediation I conducted, there were 2 lawyers at the table, and partway through that mediation, one of the lawyers leaned behind her client's head and mouthed to me, right? And that's because that lawyer is human too. The visuals resonate with her as well. And so people do take visual language seriously because it's kind of embedded in our DNA, right? We've been using visuals right from the very start. Now we are addicted to this steady diet of rich visual communication that comes in through our phones. And people instinctively get this stuff. I'm actually going to skip over this part, but this is just an exercise to show you that the list of concepts here can all be easily shown using a simple dialogue bubble. And so I would have asked you to match these up, which means which. And the purpose of that is to just show how much depth and meaning can be communicated in very simple visual language. So I think really understanding that people find visuals deeply meaningful because there's so much information embedded in them. And we instinctively know how to extract that meaning out. So I said earlier that I think if you are committed to working this way, it creates this culture, super culture of collaboration. And I really believe that in my visual facilitation practice, but I super believe it in my mediation practice. And I'll tell you why. The first thing is that when you have people in conflict and you ask them what the problem is, they will often say, that person's the problem. Him doing that, he's the problem. And he'll say, no, he's the problem. It's him doing that. That's the problem. And so one of the cardinal, things about mediation is that people are never the problem. They're never the problem. The problem is the problem. And that's part of the work that the mediator does, is to understand what has brought people to the mediation table and to be able to frame the problem in a way that it exists outside of the people and in a form that it's articulated neutrally so that they can actually solve and work on the thing instead of point fingers at each other. And I think that when working visually, you literally externalize the problem, right? You put it up on the wall outside of the people and they start looking at it instead of looking at each other. And so not only is it a philosophical thing that's happening in the process, it's actually showing up in the physical language of the room that they're in. Secondly, I said earlier that people's biggest fear is that they are not being heard when they're there saying what's important to them about this important dispute. They're scared that they're not going to be heard. And nothing ramps up emotion than someone thinking they're not being heard. And so when they can see the important things that they're putting on the table going up on the page, they actually get validation. They can see that their contributions are being heard and logged. And that tends to help regulate emotion. I think one of the biggest things, and now I will go back to the story of my first divorce mediation. I knew nothing about how mediation worked. The mediator did not conduct any pre-mediation, which means taking the chance to get to know me individually first and understand the situation from my point of view. Did none of that. I showed up to this legal office with my lawyer. My husband was there with his lawyer, and we had this mediator who I didn't know from a hole in the wall. And we started the process, and he would talk, and then I would talk, and he would talk, and then I would talk. And she was writing notes down on her notepad. We were sitting at this big, fancy, wooden, legal looking table. And I kept leaning as far as I could in my chair, just trying to get a peek at what was on her notepad. Because I was wondering to myself, is she believing that? When he talks, when he says what he just said, what is she thinking about that? She's taking notes. Is she taking his side? Does she think that's really important? I couldn't tell what she was thinking or taking from the conversation. And because she's supposed to be neutral, I didn't have any way of knowing she was actually fulfilling that role of neutrality. And I started to not really trust in her. And I started to not really trust in the process. And so in working visually, I think what shifts for people is I am making myself vulnerable as a mediator. I'm getting in front of that piece of paper and I'm writing down what I think I just heard in a way that's going to demonstrate I'm not taking anybody's side. And so in doing so, it allows people to trust that I am staying impartial, which, by the way, is not always easy to do. It's a real growth experience to try to learn how to stay neutral because we're wired to judge everything. Lastly, I think working visually creates focus. What you put up on the wall is what people are going to focus more on. And that is really important in a dispute situation. So you don't want people focused on the unproductive stuff. So you have to filter things very carefully because what you put up there is going to create a very powerful focus. Brian, how's our chat box doing? Oh, I see Brian's on the phone. Let me just pause here and because I know I've been talking at you. Why don't we open it up for any questions or comments? I'm curious to know what's brewing in your brains.
Well, my mind is a little bit blown because I've been trained. I was trained first in mediation. I have a certificate from Duquesne University in mediation from a long time ago. And then I received some training in visual facilitation. But I've never done the two at the same time. And hearing you speak has made so many connections for me, because actually the way I was trained in mediation, it was always visual, but I never understood how important that visual aspect was to it, because it's just how I naturally do things. So yeah, hearing you speak has just made tons of connections for me.
Well, my work here is done.
Good job.
It sounds like you are ready to start embracing working this way, and you've already got all the skills to do that, and now you understand why that matters so much. And I when I was going through my mediation training, they would always say, in stage one, when you're framing the issues, get the flip chart and write it down in front of these people. Like it was some type of revolutionary step you had to perform, right? You always had to do that. And my point back to the mediation school is, why? Why do you think that's so important? It's important in just listing out the agenda items. It's important through the whole process. So I'm curious, when you say that you learned mediation working visually, what does that mean?
Just what you said, the importance of listing, what people's interests were, and using that to draw connections. And then also, I would write the agreement at the end, on a flip chart as well, like crafting it together. And so that was up there, in front of everyone to agree on.
Awesome.
Yeah. And unfortunately now I work in evaluation, and we do have a lot of disagreements, and I'm trying to think of how I can use all these things together in the context of evaluation.
Well, hopefully you don't sleep tonight thinking about it.
Okay. Thank you.
Other comments or questions? Barb, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I find that when I'm facilitating verbally and then also doing drawings, I have a really hard time switching gear. And I'm wondering how you're dealing with that. It's that when I'm in the verbal mode, it's really hard to, that shifting back and forth. And, it looked like your drawing was almost entirely text. Do they come out almost entirely as text? That stuff. Yeah,
it's a great question. I will say first a little bit about my setup in my office. I have a circular table because I know that that shape carries meaning, and the shape of the table my people sit at carries meaning. And my seat is always closest to the wall. So I'm sitting, within arm's distance of the wall. I work in my chair a lot more than I would if I was facilitating. Usually I'm on my feet. I don't want to be on my feet when I'm with my parties, because I don't want to create this, I'm doing this process to you feeling. So I'm with them and I'm in a swivel chair. And so I'm doing this, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing this, so that I can get back and be with them tightly connected as quickly as possible. And I'll just go back and share a couple more slides with you that speak to your question. It's what stops a lot of people from embracing working this way is this stupid belief that we all have. Even I have it after 15 years of working visually. It's like, I still am scared for the day when someone's going to figure out that I can't actually draw. And that stops people. And, you know, we know that's simply not true, right? You can learn visual vocabulary the same way that you can learn to speak a foreign language. And when you learn to speak Spanish, you start with hello, where's the washroom? You know, very simple things like that. And, you know, 5 years later, maybe you can write a poem and you can do it without a lot of effort. Learning visual language is the same thing, right? There's components of your vocabulary that all have meaning. So color has meaning, shape has meaning, text has meaning, you know, line has meaning, and of course, imagery has meaning. And to your question, Barb, I actually don't use visuals a lot when I'm working in mediation live. Yes, imagery shows up in the stuff I've created ahead of time, but when I'm actually working real time with people, it doesn't have to look good. And like, look how crappy this looks. There's nothing special about this. There's no imagery, right? There's shape, there's line, there's an arrow. What is happening here is that there is some level of categorization or organization of the information on the page that's starting to give it some structure. And so I would say it's a lot more about making critical decisions about what to put up on the page, what not to put up on the page so as to further trigger people. And imagery is the last thing on my mind, unless it matters to the conversation. And so I hope that comes as a big relief, because I would say that if you are a visual facilitator and you're gonna go get some mediation training and start working visually in mediation, you only need a subset of the skills you already have, which is great news. And if you're the mediator who's just now learning to work visually, don't worry about the imagery part. You know, when you look at this, you know, rough, raw looking thing here, it is rough and raw because we were solving something in real time. And after these people figure out their parenting schedule, no one's going home to frame this and commemorate the awesome mediation they had, right? We don't want them to stay stuck in the problem. We want them to make the agreement, get past it, move on. And so it would be a disservice to the process if they took away a pretty polished looking map that people wanted to stay in relationship with. Other comments or questions? Dean.
I had to unmute. Here I am. So when we talk about visuals, you know, I think we can talk about them in two ways. And something that you referred to really early on, it was a question that came out from your conversation with Brian, apparently, right? That there are templates and so on and so forth. And something I'm going to be talking about, you know, in a couple of weeks is about the idea of diagramming, right? Which is, you know, bare bones human visual processes, right? We categorize, we pattern, we make patterns. And as you showed, the last piece that you just showed, you put up a calendar, you know, a diagram. So I guess what I wanted to know is, I would love to see some of the diagrams or the things that you use as tools to help people have those conversations, to pull out all that nasty emotion, which is, of course, you know, part of the block of communication, and it helps clarify, helps them get to decisions. But my question also is, do you find moments at times when you ask them to do the writing on the wall, or ask them to proactively, rather than you function as the scribe, where you actually turn them into, you know, make them do the process, which, you know, I think, now I'm speaking my own opinion, I think that of course helps them clarify their own thinking. So, and again, I have not gone through your training as a mediator, but it would just fascinate me to know more about that.
Well, I have to say, and and this connects a little bit to Barb's earlier question, is I have had times in mediation where there's so much emotion in the room that I give it up. I stop doing that work because I am making a decision that it's more important to be there in that moment with them, really connected. So sometimes that happens when emotion gets really, really intense. Let me just go back to sharing my screen with you to cap off what I was saying about that, that page with the calendar on it. It's nothing special. It's nothing you're gonna share with anyone and say, hey, look at how great this looks. And so the belief for me is my visuals when I'm mediating, they should be fugly, which for me is a combination of F and ugly, right?
Yep.
They should be. They should look that way because it's not art, it's communication, and you're assisting them in their process. It's not about you and how well you can or cannot draw. And so, Dean, you asked, like, show me some of how you actually work with people in process. And this is the process that I use because I'm trained in this interest-based mediation model. And so basically, when I draw the process as my client would go through it, first, they're considering mediation. They're in a pickle. They're looking at what are my options? Should I go to court? Should I go to arbitration? Can we work this out at our own kitchen table? What's this thing called mediation? Should I do it? If they decide to inquire about mediation, they will come and meet with me for usually a couple of hours to have their questions answered about the process, to sign off on and understand what it means to agree to participate in mediation, and then to tell me what they think I need to know about their situation. And that's a confidential conversation. So anything I learn in that conversation, I will never raise when we get to the table in joint mediation. And both parties get that opportunity to meet with me in that way. And then when we actually start to mediate, the process itself goes through 4 stages, right? Which is like hearing the situation, understanding what the issues are, and framing them in a neutral way that they can be solved. Putting the information that's needed to solve those issues on the table, generating options or possibilities of how they might build agreement, and then, actually evaluating those options and making choices about how they want to solve that. And then they go away and they go through an after mediation phase. And when I was thinking about, where to apply visuals in the process I use, it really came back to something Christina Merkley taught me, more than a decade ago, which is visuals can be used to push information at people, and they can be used to pull information from people. And so I went back and I looked at my process and I said, where in the process do I, as the mediator, need them to know something process-wise? Like where, if they didn't have this information, would compromise their ability to be successful in the process. And so where you see these red question marks is where I know there's stuff I got to get across to them to answer these questions. So when they're at the front end, they're wondering, what is this divorce going to be like? And where does mediation fit in the process of getting a divorce? And then when they come to see me, they're like, okay, what is this mediation process? What actually happens here? And then when they're at the tail end, they're like, okay, we've got a pile of agreements. How do we turn this into a legally binding court enforceable document? And so I can anticipate their needs and the questions that are going to be coming up for them. And so I have created things like this, which is answering that person's question of what is divorce going to be like? Well, it's going to be a roller coaster ride, everybody. And it's got some unpleasant parts. But the good news is that when you get to the other end, you will find new purpose in your life. And this roller coaster ride is otherwise called the grieving process. And why I want you to think about what that ride's going to be like for you and where you're at on the roller coaster now and where your other conflict partner might be at is because where you're at in the grief process impacts how you will make decisions at the mediation table. And so they and me benefit from knowing where they are at in the grieving process. I also need them to clearly understand how the process is going to work, that I am not a lawyer, that my job is to document the agreements they make, but I'm not giving them a court enforceable document, that they're actually going to have to go to a lawyer and get some help to make that happen after the process. And when I was, going through mediation mentorship, I watched the mediator I was mentoring with say that to people, like sometimes 4 or 5 times over in a single conversation, and they still didn't take it in. This idea that you're not walking away with a binding document. So I need them to know this, because if they don't know how the process works, they're not going to be an empowered participant in it. And as a impartial or a neutral, I can't advocate for them because I wouldn't be being impartial. And so they have to be equipped to go through the process as an empowered participant. On the flip side, if we go back and look at my 4-stage process, I know that there's other times where these parties have to put information on the table. So it's a pull in order for them to solve the problem. And so when they come to me in pre-mediation, I'm primarily concerned with, what's your story? Like, why are you here? How did you get to this need for mediation? When we get together and we're setting the foundation for mediation, really what we're asking is, how are we all going to show up here? How are we going to run this space and be in this space together? Once we've got that down, okay, well, what are we here to solve? And then we move into the nuts and bolts of what's important to each of you and why, what's the information that we need to consider, and what might we possibly do here? And so I will use templates. For example, this is a template that I use, and it is a free download on my website. I use this template to set the foundation at this stage of the mediation, right? It covers off both these questions that are happening in stages 1 and 2, which is, how are we going to work together and what are we actually here to solve? And I developed this template because I know it doesn't matter who the parties are or what type of dispute it is or where this is happening, we still need to go through these same things in every mediation. So it makes sense to have a template that you can use over and over and over again. The next template I created just kind of as a giveaway to people, knowing that when they go off to parent their kids, they're probably going to get in other conflicts in the future, right? They're going to have other fights about stuff. And once people have been through a mediation process, they at least have the memory of how a conversation unfolded to get to a solution. And so this is, this template uses this metaphor of an iceberg, right? And what I'll say to people is, this is you stuck in this boat with this other person, and you're in stormy seas, right? And if you can manage to navigate around this this iceberg, there's sunnier days on the other side, and in a minute I'll ask you, how are you going to know you've been successful here? What'll be different for you? And then I tell them, usually the conversations they've tried to have are above the waterline in the iceberg that can be seen. And the real work that they're there to do in mediation is to get below the waterline and really communicate more effectively about what's important to each of them and why that matters so much. Taking that iceberg metaphor and blowing it up, this is essentially the same thing as this image. So, but can you see how my mediation process articulated this way looks linear, Gina, you would know it's not linear, especially when there's multiple issues to be solved. It's not a linear process. And so this is essentially the same process, but just conceptualized differently, which is when you're above the water line, you're each entrenched. You say, well, I think it should be this way, and I think it should be that way. And when you're coming from those starting positions, there's nothing wrong with them. It's just you need to recognize you're on separate mountains that never the two will meet. And so to find that meeting place, you have to go below the waterline. And so you have to frame the issue in a way that it can be solved. And then you actually have to have the conversation to understand what is that other person actually interested in beneath the words they're saying. What do they really care about? And why does that matter to them? As well as articulate for yourself what matters to you and why. And then to look across both those buckets and say, hey, there's a couple things in here we both care about. Because that can become a powerful place to start to generate possibilities from. And then, you kind of brainstorm, well, hey, what could we do here? Let's just brainstorm some different ways this could go. And then you look at those and you say, yeah, that one won't work. That one, maybe, that one, I like that one, you don't, you start to do that type of analysis and make a choice. And hopefully you arrive at a shared solution. And so that's another example of a template that I would actually send home with people and say, for future use, when you're in a dispute, try having the conversation this way. And this template acts as a guide for what that might sound like. I also have lots of other templates around visioning for people's kids' futures. Let's see if I can find it here. Yeah. So when people are coming to build parenting agreements, I will give them each this same template, and they'll take it home, and I'll give it to them as homework. And they have to sort of think for themselves, what are the family values that I'm trying to instill in my child? What is the future? Sorry, it's backwards when I do this. What is the future that I want for my child? Who do I think my child is now? What are their emotional needs? What are their physical needs? How are they doing developmentally? All of that type of thinking about their child. I mean, people in solid marriages don't think this stuff through. But when they're going through a divorce, I can send them home with this. They fill it out. And when they get back to mediation, we hang them up side by side on the wall, and we make sense of where are you lined up and where are you thinking completely differently about your child. And we can pick up a lot of speed doing it this way versus starting that conversation verbally for the first time when we're together. So all that to say, yes, I put pens in their hands. Yes, templates have a use at certain times for certain reasons. And yes, I have had the situation when working on a blank piece of paper where somebody said, you mind if I take over the marker? And my response is, please, right? Any other questions or comments? I see someone's fixing something. I love that.
Well, one thing that occurred to me with Dean's comment too is, I love the diagrams, by the way. The templates are beautiful. I remember when I was going through training, the trainer had these postcards of different images. And I thought about how when somebody comes in the pre-mediation stage, you could have these postcards laid out on a table and a person could pick up a postcard that speaks to how they're feeling in that moment. And then they could say why they picked up the postcard. And it would be a way of sort of communicating something deeper about what people are bringing into the room in that moment. And it would also, you know, before you start, give a moment of reflection, you know, where they could think about why, you know, which postcard do I want and what am I going to say about it and why?
Yeah.
And then another point when you could, you know, pull information from them would be in generating options. You know, I could see having people write down options on large sticky notes that would then go up on the board. And the reason why that would be an advantage is because, again, you could have a quiet moment where, you know, if you're in a dispute where one person tends to talk over the other person, or they don't have, you know, that mental space, you can have a quiet moment where they're doing something, you know, brainstorming options, and then you put them up there, and they wouldn't all live, you know, like maybe some of those would come down, but maybe some of them would be things that would work. And then you could do the postcard thing at the end, you know, and as like a enter exit strategy to see what people feel like after the mediation.
Yeah, I'm just texting my son to feed the dog because my dog's like clockwork and he's outside my office door looking for dinner. I love the way that you're thinking, Christine. And I think, you know, I certainly, when people show up to my office for the first time, whatever is on the wall is there on purpose. And I will always say to them, you know, would you like a cup of tea? I'll go make a cup of tea. And that's all on purpose, because I know that they're going to sit there and they're going to take in what's on the wall. And so I think that's another thing too, that the field of mediation has a long way to grow up in, is designing the space to support the process properly. And I think we can be more thoughtful about that. What else was I going to say? Oh, yes. I think I love, you know, you're thinking about the cards and the this and the that. And something that I believe is, well, probably we should all be taught dispute resolution skills in high school. And for some reason, we're not. The same way we're not taught how to make marriages work and how to communicate and how to have healthy relationships and all that. And so I think one of the opportunities in working visually in mediation is that the visuals themselves can make transparent to the parties the frameworks that are in the mediator's head, right? We should be building their capacity to solve their own disputes in the future. And when the template you use shows them the framework, you're building capacity. And I've thought of similar things like, you know, the mediation communication skills you have, Gina, where you know how to frame something neutrally, or you know how to, you know, paraphrase or whatever. Could you create a card deck that teaches those communication skills so that when people find themselves stuck in a conversation, they can pull a card and play the card and it actually shifts the discussion, right? Like, we should be teaching those skills and building capacity as we're working with people. See how hepped up I get about it?
Yeah, Lisa, I totally agree with that point. I was just looking back in the notes I've taken, and it was around being client-centric and innovative. And I think, you know, the real crux is you actually, I mean, we keep thinking this is all about a process we run, which it is, but actually the power of it is building that capacity in people to take it away and use it.
Yes.
So, and I've worked largely in the juvenile justice and child protection area, where it's usually a state intervening in people's lives, and working in this way allows it to level the playing field. Where, yeah, I'm really being a facilitator of a process that levels the playing field, where people can participate almost as equal participants. And they see their words and their thoughts up on the wall, so it's theirs. It's not this process that's owned by somebody else. And it's incredibly powerful. I mean, I've heard you talk about this quite a few times now, but it's really starting to gel even more. So Yeah.
Glad. Again,
Yeah,
my work here is done.
Yeah.
I love to hear that. I want to, you're kind of twigging me on something else, which I wrestle with sometimes as a pioneer in this space. And that is that, as a visual facilitator, when I go to work with that board to create their strategy and they're having a discussion, my job in the room is to wrap my arms around all of it and to, as accurately as possible, reflect back on that paper what actually happened in the room. Like all of it, all the diverse thinking. In mediation, it's very different. I'm filtering and making process-based decisions about what to put on the wall and purposely what not to put on the wall. And what's dicey about that, or feels a little bit godlike in responsibility, is that not everything both parties bring to the conversation is useful. And so if I'm only putting on the page what one party is saying and not the other, what's the impression that's being created?
I think you alluded to it really early. People need to feel that their view is validated. You don't have to, it doesn't have to, you don't have to agree with it, the other person, but at least the fact that it's there means that it is validated. And then, in terms of that neuroscience stuff, if people feel validated, they can they can go from this to this a little, then they can move on. And I just wonder in your process, how much of it is intuitive? And you're picking up on what to capture, what will allow us to move forward.
It's very intuitive. Very, very intuitive. And that's why I think about it. It's like I'm trying to understand myself. And the other, I guess, beauty about it is this idea that not everything on the paper is benign to the process here. And sometimes you're going to get it wrong. Like something you put up there, you didn't get the right meaning, or it's triggering somebody and it's ramping things back up because they're sitting there and looking at this thing behind you that they don't agree with. And so I suppose the silver lining of that is it makes it really dead obvious to the mediator what still needs to be worked on. Right? Yeah. It shows you exactly when people are reacting to what's up there on the wall. It shows you there's more work to be done.
Yeah. And I guess the converse of that, if you're just working verbally and somebody gets stuck on something, they just hold on to it, and everything that comes afterwards, they're not even hearing it anyway. So even if it's wrong, you've given them permission to say, they can at least object or query it, and that it can be dealt with. Whereas if it's done verbally and you've moved forward, it'll undermine the process going forward.
Well said. And Christine, you said something too about when generating ideas, maybe they're not all good ones and some are going to hit the cutting room floor. And when I'm using that visual mediation agenda template with the iceberg on it, I will, as we're framing the issues, I'll put each one on a separate sticky note and I'll put it in the box that says items for discussion. And when the parties, I find a couple things about that. One is that I negotiate with them, where do we start on this laundry list of issues? And typically what comes out is it's not a linear list. And they will start to rearrange the sticky notes to show how the issues are interconnected, which tells me a lot about how they might need to approach the problem-solving conversation. Tells me, well, like, what's the core thing here? Or maybe there's two core things and everything else is kind of around that. So you get a sense of the shape of the relationship of the issues, as well as once we've made agreements around an issue, I will use a big dramatic tear that issue on the sticky note off the agenda, crumple it up, throw it on the ground, stand on top of it, and like, we're moving on, you know, because it gives them physical feedback that they're making progress, right? They can see that they've made some momentum and they start to invest or trust the process more. I'm curious to hear a little bit more from you guys, whether you're in mediation situations or not. I know Brian was sharing, hey, I've been in some facilitated meetings where, you know, stuff's gone on and we've had to deal with it. I'm curious what you have learned about what works, either working visually or otherwise, when you find yourself in that seat of trying to help people resolve something. What else do you know that I don't know yet?
Lisa, it's Casey here. You've covered a lot of ground tonight, and I think you actually covered this a little bit earlier. Is one of the things I find really helpful with groups is when there's disagreement in the room or there's tension in the room. It often comes from, in some ways, I think 3 things, and I'm not sure if it's learned or something I've just read or something I've experienced. Often it's not that they don't like each other. It's the fact that, though it can be, but it often comes down to first covering the information. Let's ensure everybody's on the same page with the facts on both sides. Get just the raw facts out, and you know, the what, when, why, where, and how. You know, when did this happen? What's the issue? How much does it cost? Just raw numbers often help in that case. And sometimes you'll find in that moment, just from that discussion of the numbers or the facts, you know, how many people, how much you think it's going to cost, when is it? Someone might go, oh, we disagreed on how big it was or how small it was. And then after that, it's often, if that doesn't solve the case, it often comes down to, at least from my perspective, and I'm probably wrong here, just from what I've experienced, is it comes down to where their values are at. And often it's a dispute over something. So one of the things people like to think about, strengths and weaknesses. I just like diving right into the strengths. Say, what are the strengths about your idea? Let that person speak about it let them say everything they're going to say, then let the other person say whatever they're saying and capture their exact words and what they're saying. And often I find, though, there's things they'll agree on, things they'll disagree on. And where there's disagreement, it's the thing is, then you get to a paradox. How can we do this? And how can we do this at the same time? How can we find something to address the 2 of these? And often that'll resolve the issue. And if that doesn't resolve it, they just don't like each other. And that's why you need a professional mediator coming in the room.
Yeah, I think you're really right. Oftentimes in the process, more information, complete information, accurate information goes a long way. And something one of my mentors taught me is, when you're in that scenario and one party didn't have some information, but has like taken a real strong stand, they've gone way out on a limb on a position, and then new information makes it on the table, is to turn to that person and say, is that new information for you? Right? Because it gives them an opportunity to save face without having to say, I was wrong, I didn't know. You kind of take that on for them and you say, is that new information for you? Right? Yeah.
I'm coming from much more of a facilitation space, but I think part of, what I often do with any conversation or any group is really starting to ask of, what do you want to get out of our time together? Because I think it's helpful to kind of shift. There might be conflict or things going on, but it's like, I think the last thing anybody wants is to have spent 2 or 3 hours and feel like you've gotten nowhere. And again, you might not be able to resolve everything, but at least if you can start with, why are we showing up here today? And like, what would be at least one positive outcome from the conversation today? That I think, again, that's where, people, especially when they're in a really stuck state, it's like, how can I at least feel that I'm moving in a more positive direction or able to resolve at least one part of the tension that I'm experiencing?
Yes. Agree. And sometimes I feel, when I ask that question, I ask people, when you get to the other side of that iceberg and you're in the sunnier skies, how are you going to know you've been successful here in mediation? sometimes I feel like I'm asking a stupid question. Like they look at me and they're like, well, we won't have as much tension. Our kids will have stability. Like it's all the obvious stuff, right? But if they don't articulate it, then it's hard to, especially in mediation, to really have them embrace that they are responsible for those outcomes and getting to that place. So yes, kudos to that. What else do you guys know works? I think while you're thinking, I would add on to that, that sometimes I like to ask people, what are the qualities of the conversation you came here to have? Like, what kind of a conversation is it? If you described it in 3 words, is it fair? Is it balanced? Is it cutthroat? Is it like, you name it? They're your 3 qualities. And I find sometimes future casting with people, like I'll say to people when they're working on this template, I'll say to them, I want you to imagine that it's like 17 years down the road and your kids are all grown up and they're getting ready to go off somewhere, and somebody goes up in the attic and they find the box that's got your separation agreement in it. And they actually read through all the stuff you guys agreed to here. And when they read that document, they say, holy shit, Mom and Dad were really when they made this agreement. Like, what would those 3 describing words be, right? And that forces people to think about the quality of the conversation that might get them to that outcome they say they want, Joe. Any other comments? This is so great. I love having the opportunity to talk about this with you. I promised that I would share thoughts about getting started working visually. And as I said earlier, if you've already got the visual skill set, pretty much ignore everything I'm going to say. Just go get some really good training in mediation. And if you're coming at it from the other point of view, this is one of the favorite quotes from Harold Strawbridge, who is somebody who works visually. And I took his quote and turned it into a visual because it struck me that way, which is, don't worry about having to draw to work visually. You don't have to, you don't have to, you don't have to. All you need to do is get some markers, set your space, get a whiteboard, some sheets of paper, and he says, and a knife to cut the roots that keep you in your seat, that stop you, those stupid stuffed beliefs we have that stop us from working this way. So my philosophy as I started experimenting with visual mediation was to, anything I have created, if it's helpful to you, please take it, try it. I want to share those tools freely. And so if you are conducting mediations on my website, you can go and download this visual mediation template. And it comes with a step-by-step guide about how to introduce it to your clients, how to set your space to use it, and so on. So that's one free, real small, easy way you can start to experiment. Secondly, I would say if you are a mediator dispute resolution practitioner, I have created a mini online course. It's $147, and it walks you through everything you need to know to be able to design your own templates that speak to your process, because your process is probably different from mine, or it might have things in common with mine. But so that you learn to, instead of me giving you a fish, you learn to fish for yourself when it comes to templates. And this is a great way to start thinking about where in your practice does a template make sense and not make sense, and how do you go from blank piece of paper to a tool that you can reproduce and use over and over and over again. For you visual practitioners on the call, you do not need this course. You already know how to make templates and apply them. And then lastly, I spent about a year of my life building this comprehensive online program for mediators and dispute resolution practitioners. And this is really the, hey, I want to go whole hog on this. I want to learn everything I need to know from A to B to really embrace being a visual mediator and to integrate these methods into my practice fully. And so when you register for this course, it gives you lifetime access, because I believe that's important, because this is a long learning journey. You start it somewhere and you never stop it. So I really believe you need lifetime access, because you're going to pick up some skills, you're going to go out there, you're going to try them on for size, and you're going to keep getting better and better and building your skills and building your skills. And so lifetime access, there's about 40 hours of video instruction with yours truly. And what I have done is define that subset of skills that you need as a mediator to work visually. So again, if you're already a visual facilitator, you do not need this program. You need to go and get some mediation training. And the full program, it really is, like I said, soup to nuts, in that it starts with, learning the lingo, getting the right tools, setting your space, learning how to create templates, learning how to create information graphics, learning the visual vocabulary itself, learning how to protect confidentiality, the things you need to consider in your agreement to mediate, how to market yourself as a visual mediator, and so on. So it's really everything you need to know to launch a practice working visually. So let me just stop there and see if there's any other questions or comments. If anybody is interested in that comprehensive program, I will send Brian a discount code, which is really just a thank you for listening to me rant on about how important I think this is. And it will give you 25% off of that tuition fee. So I will send that to Brian, and if that's of any interest to you, just reach out to him and you can receive that code. Any other questions or comments? I see in the chat box and a knife to cut the roots. Yeah. That's fabulous.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lisa. This was amazing. I really, really enjoyed it, and you have been really good. Just experiences to share, and it's a really great tool. And I love how you've really leveraged visuals with mediation, all of that. So I just wanted, Brian had to step away, so I'm gonna pick up on one of the other organizers.
Sure.
So I just wanted to thank you. And then are there any kind of final questions before we kind of stop and we can close out? All right.
Well, just because our time here is coming to a conclusion, I would say let's not stop talking about this. Feel free to be in touch with me on social media or reach out by email. I'm always happy to continue talking with you about this. And I want to hear how your own skill sets evolve, if blending those two skill sets is of interest to you.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.